So not too long ago on this channel, I actually covered a press conference that was mostly allegedly Somali legitimate business owners in the state of Minnesota demanding $200 million in reparations due to the fact that they lost business, they lost revenues because of the ICE raids in that particular state, scaring away their customers. Now, of course, considering that the ICE raids were triggered in part by rampant Somali fraud in the state of Minnesota, specifically in the Minneapolis and St. Paul area, it seemed rather curious, rather odd that these same Somali business owners, some of which may have been connected to these fraudulent schemes, would show up at the Capitol and demand more taxpayer money in the form of grants, in the form of reparations. By the way, they did so with upside down signs and all sorts of other absurdities that were present in this press conference. But it turns out there is in fact a program that does exist in the state of Minnesota in order to give some kind of grant to businesses that are negatively impacted by racial discrimination and, of course, political riots. And by the way, this actually dates back to the George Floyd riots. And while there are some cases where people had their businesses damaged by said riots that, of course, were allowed to happen by the Minneapolis mayor and by Governor Tim Walz, already we're starting to see the local news media look into the fact that many of these grants are going to questionable people. So we have a scenario where once again another Minnesota taxpayer program is going to potentially fraudulent businesses. This time some of the red flags are actually the transportation companies, which we've heard about before, and sole proprietorships. And this is what we're going to talk about today, because the one thing that can never stop, the one thing that can never end, is the taxpayer dollars flowing to these fraudulent businesses in the state of Minnesota. But before we get into that, before we discuss it, I want to thank everybody for funneling your money to me over at actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay?
The business was struggling because it had just experienced the situation of the George Floyd.
Then a lifeline from the Minnesota Promise Grant. She received more than $30,000 from the state's program designed to help small businesses like hers, impacted by racial discrimination, civil unrest, and other barriers to funding. Holmes says she used the money to fix her company van.
It was a vital piece that, helped me to continue moving through.
So there's a very good local news media segment from ABC5 out in Minneapolis that does great reporting on this particular issue. It will be linked in the description right there. And as you just saw, this woman who ran a laundromat that was damaged and of course lost business due to the George Floyd riots was able to get $31,000 from this Promise program in order to fix a van that was crucial, according to her, for her business. But the thing is, not every single business owner who receives these grants is as transparent. We don't have the damage being presented to us in this kind of obvious way. And when the program is $100 million and there are 650 winners in said program, and you can get up to $50,000 each without any transparency, obviously this is something that we need to look into, especially in the state of Minnesota, because it probably is a fraudulent operation, at least to some degree. And again, this is exactly what the local news affiliate decided to do with this segment. That will be linked in full in the description, so you could check it out for yourself in its full context. However, they actually did say in the beginning of said segment that they're not alleging fraud at this moment in time. However, when you read through what is actually written about this program, and of course they try to investigate the recipients of the grants from this program, obviously we have very similar signs to what we saw with the Leering Center, which of course means that these people never lear their lesson over in the state of Minnesota. So there's been over 650 winners named so far in the Twin Cities metro area, including the laundromat that I highlighted earlier, that I have no reason to believe in any way, shape, or form is involved in any kind of fraudulent operation. But it says that there's a mix of long-standing businesses and more than 300 recipients that are listed as individuals, not business names, who the state actually qualifies because they're sole proprietors. And according to 5 Investigates, many of them work in the transportation sector, a detail that the state only disclosed after repeated requests for more information. Now, you guys might not be familiar with the different tax designations and the fact that a sole proprietorship could in fact be a legitimate form of business. In fact, if you're a YouTube channel when you're just starting out and this is your sole source of income, you will file for taxes as a sole proprietor unless you set up an LLC or an S corporation or some kind of business entity for that particular channel. So I'm well familiar with this particular concept. However, if you're telling me that these people are filing as sole proprietors and yet they're still eligible for these grants up to $50,000 due to the fact that they may have faced racial discrimination or something else related, like to the George Floyd riots, or of course to the ICE riots that have happened in the state of Minnesota, that obviously brings up a lot of questions, because technically, if you get all of your money from Uber, where you're an independent contractor, and you don't have an LLC like many Uber drivers will not, then that leaves you in a situation where you could be giving up to $50,000 grants to taxi cab drivers in the state of Minnesota for something that is supposed to help businesses that are supposedly damaged by all the problems in the state of Minnesota. And again, it's not like the state was forthcoming with this information. They had to be pressed over and over again by the My 5 Investigates team. Again, link to their whole segment in the description of this video before this was revealed. And since they said around 650 plus businesses ended up receiving these grants, and 300 of them might be sole proprietorship / transportation companies that are also sole proprietorships, obviously this is incredibly questionable. Obviously, this is something that is quite alarming, again, especially when you consider the fact that Minnesota's programs like this have been defrauded time and time again. And one of the things that is also incredibly curious about these grants given is one particular company that is highlighted by the 5 Investigates team is that they actually found a housing stabilization company called Housing Care Inc. that received a grant of $33,500. But state records have shown that the company has billed Medicaid nearly $4 million since 2023, including through a state housing program shut down last fall amid fraud concerns. Now look, we've actually covered these particular types of schemes on this channel multiple different times in relation to Somali fraud scandals in the state of Minnesota. It's not exactly the Leering Center / daycare issue. It's also not the Feeding Our Future issue. This is a separate instance where Medicaid actually will provide housing vouchers to people who are desperately in need. But what we find out time and time again is that these Somali-run companies, and yes, they are disproportionately Somali-run companies, will consume a massive amount of tax dollars from the government, use social security numbers of homeless people, of people going through drug addiction, or of people who are disabled, overbill for services. And again, when the whole thing ends up blowing up, these people that were reliant on this Medicaid program in order to get housing will end up living on the streets. We actually covered somebody who has a mental disability that they were overbilling for repeatedly in the state of Minnesota, a young girl, and guess what? This young girl is now homeless, and she's been homeless for about 8 months due to the fact that she was evicted from her home due to the fact that this program was investigated for fraud. And again, that girl right there, there's actually body cam video of her being evicted, and it's absolutely tragic when you look at it.
I'm not Jane or John Doe. That's what's confusing.
Sky ordered to pack up what she could carry.
Grab what you've just packed because we need to exit the apartment now.
And get out.
We need to go. Come on.
Okay.
We need to go.
Let's go.
How are you?
Go.
Okay, sorry.
Set up out to the hallway.
And like that, a vulnerable young woman put on the street.
Buy house. Buy house. What's balls?
Now, the other thing that is a giant red flag is that $4 million since 2023 from Medicaid is going to work out to well over $1 million a year, because if you have 2023, 2024, and then 2025, assuming that this does not go up to 2026, which we are just in the beginning of, then yeah, you divide 4 million by 3 years, and you are going to get well over the average of $1 million a year. And even if you count 2026 for some reason as if the full full year has passed, that would still be $1 million per year for 4 years. But the thing is, this particular program is only supposed to be available to businesses that make under $750,000 in revenue, not in profit, in revenue, yet they're already tapping the government for all of this revenue in the Medicaid department based on the fact that they're just able to get away with it. So again, you have the state of Minnesota setting up a program that is supposed to help small businesses. It's the I Promise grant program, so these are not loans, this is free taxpayer money, and you have businesses that participate in government programs that have to be shut down due to fraud also participating in this particular program, according to the Investigates team over at ABC5 in Minneapolis. But what's even more interesting is that this guy actually decided that he was going to call some of these businesses, try to talk to them, try to ask them what's up, try to ask them what they're doing with this money, how they're getting this money, if their business is legitimate. And let's just say the people that were called, not very happy to be hearing from the local news media, who, by the way, has a history of uncovering these fraud schemes in the state of Minnesota. Because like I said, the state of Minnesota isn't prosecuting this. They may pretend that they are, but they're absolutely not. It's usually the federal government, and typically the federal government gets tipped off not by the state's government, but by local reporters.
You can call 911 if you want. I'm just trying to find out what you're using the funds for.
So isn't that an interesting response? Isn't that a curious response that when you get a call from a reporter on the phone, again, not in a threatening way at all whatsoever, and they're trying to ask you who received this grant that should be available information to the public, what you spent that money on, instead of doing the interview like the regular ordinary laundromat owner who had been in Minneapolis for 15 years and can actually explain her hardship that was caused by the George Floyd riots, you end up saying that you're going to call the police on the reporter for daring to call your public business number. Is that not a little bit curious? Is that not a little bit odd? Is that not a little bit suspicious? But I guess in the state of Minnesota, this is standard fare because you're supposed to give your money to these questionable organizations that are tied in, by the way, with other fraud schemes like the housing one that we talked about earlier. But then when people ask about that money, you call the police on them. Remember, Nick Shirley was threatened multiple different times with police calls and all sorts of resistance when he tried to ask whether or not there were actually kids in these daycare centers that, by the way, going back years, even a decade in this particular state, people have been pointing out were actually fraudulent. But guess what? The business owners, and specifically the Somali business owners, do not feel the need to answer any of those questions. Your taxpayer dollars are owed to them, so just pay them and shut the hell up. Now, there's also another company that they highlight specifically that, again, is in the home care business, and they received $47,000, which is nearly the maximum of $50K that you can get from this particular program. However, this particular business, quite suspicious in that their license was actually revoked 2 years ago, and according to the local news media, they don't actually have a working phone number. So a company in an industry that is rife with fraud, that actually had their license revoked for serious violations, ends up receiving near the maximum for this particular grant, supposedly due to the George Floyd riots and evil white racism and all the different hardships that are no fault of their own, and they still end up getting this money. And by the way, when they approach the actual representative who proposed the bill in order to institute this program, he's like, no big deal, nothing to worry about, nothing to see here, and if you don't believe me, hear it for yourself.
What I say is that if there was a license that was revoked for some reason, because there could be a technicality.
They said this was a serious issue that affected that put in jeopardy the health and safety of the clients in that business.
Well, I don't know about DHS saying that. We didn't receive any notice of that. But let me also say this. We make sure that there's no fraud and there's no possibility of fraud in the Promise Act.
So when asked about this particular company that had their license revoked due to serious violations actually getting a grant near the maximum, he ends up responding by saying, well, I don't know the particulars of that. That's not really a big deal to me, because in this particular program, we actually make sure 100% that there's no fraud at all whatsoever. And then he goes on to make the case that he personally visited many of the sites that receive these grants himself, which I find rather interesting because many of the sites sites that received these grants aren't sites at all. Again, they are sole proprietorships that do transportation, so possibly even Uber drivers, and it doesn't really make all that much sense for him to be visiting them at their Uber driving car, and again, them getting the grants doesn't make any sense at all. And to be clear, even though Uber drivers are just one example of a sole proprietorship that could be a transportation business, there are also other issues with other transportation companies, and we've heard about them in relation to Nick Shirley's video and a bunch of other fraud schemes in the state of Minnesota that it also could be. But the fact that he's like, we make sure 100% that there's no fraud in the law that I proposed, there's no fraud at all whatsoever, that's why we also made it so difficult for you to figure out who's actually getting this money, because as we well know, if nobody can see where this money is going, if nobody can vet it, if nobody can cross-check it, that's how you know the fraud is absolutely impossible when nobody can actually investigate it.
Even when you think in terms of the cherry picking that I think is important for reporters to do, that I think it's important to put context around these things.
I'm not sure if cherry picking is the right term. I mean, we're going through the list to try to verify.
So I'm not here to, say that you're wrong for doing the work that you do. We want you to, because guess what? We know that there's no fraud.
So the state senator ends up accusing the local news reporter of cherry picking, and the guy's like, no, we're not cherry picking. We're actually going through all the different recipients of this, trying to verify them. And then the guy's like, oh, well, we want you to do that because we know that there's no fraud. However, his body language is definitely betraying him. Now, I also want to point out another thing, because I have been repeatedly saying Somali fraud throughout the course of this video, and many of you out there in the audience might be thinking, Sean, nobody actually mentioned any Somalis. In fact, the one grant recipient that they talked about earlier in this particular video was a regular African-American woman who had a business there for 15 years, the laundromat one, and you said that was totally fine. So what makes you think that this is disproportionately Somali? Well, the thing is, this local news segment actually has a little bit of B-roll, and if you blink, you might miss it. Again, link to the whole segment in the description of this video, and what you can actually see when this B-roll is on screen are the names of the individuals that have received or applied for these particular grants, and there's a lot of interesting names in there. You got some Ahmeds in there, and a lot of familiar Somali names that, again, we have seen appear time and time again in other Somali fraud schemes. So no, I'm not making it up at all whatsoever. It is all there. The local news media might not be highlighting it. They might not be alleging fraud at this moment in time, but what they're actually highlighting is a program lacking in transparency that appears to also be disproportionately serving the Somali community. But you know what? Those are just my thoughts. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. As per usual, if you like the video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social medias, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about yet another instance of potential Somali fraud. Till next time.